He didn't touch him. That was the first wrong thing. Zaire had been pulled through 3 different cars, handed off twice, and delivered to the front steps of a mansion so quiet it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. No shouting, no chains, no one pressing a gun into the back of his neck. Just stillness, and Kaler Virex standing at the center of it. He was tall, dark suit, no tie, one hand resting at his side like a man who had never needed to reach for anything, because everything always came to him. His eyes moved across Zaire once, slow, deliberate, the way a surgeon looks at something before he cuts. Zaire didn't move. He had learned a long time ago that stillness was armor. Show nothing. Breathe shallow. Let them think they already know what you are. But Kaler's jaw shifted, just slightly. His nostrils flared once, and then something crossed his face that Zaire had never seen on a man like him. Confusion. Leave us. The guards moved before the words finished landing. The room emptied in seconds. Doors closed. And now it was just the 2 of them standing in a space full of expensive things and uncomfortable silence. Kaler didn't step closer. He studied Zaire from exactly where he stood. Hi viewers. If you've ever been in a room where you knew something was wrong but couldn't name it yet, drop a 1-word feeling in the comments right now. Zaire kept his hands loose at his sides. He was calculating, measuring the distance to every door, counting the seconds between one breath and the next. Kaler tilted his head. You came in calm, he said, voice low, even, like the surface of water just before something moves underneath it. Not relieved, not scared. Zaire said nothing. And you don't smell right. There it was. Zaire's chest locked, but his face didn't change. He had trained for this. Trained for a long time in ways most people didn't train for anything. He kept his expression clean, blank, unreadable as paper before ink. But Kaler was already watching him too carefully. Not like an Omega who survived them, Kaler continued. He wasn't asking. He was narrating, like he was reading something only he could see. You smell like someone who was never allowed to be touched. The room tilted slightly, not physically, just internally, because that was the thing about Kaler Virex. He didn't just look at people. He read them like documents. And Zaire had spent every year of his life making sure he was impossible to read. Kaler's eyes moved over him one more time. Then, explain why you don't smell like an Omega who survived them. Silence pressed in from every corner of the room. And Zaire understood in that moment that whatever this was, it had already started. No cage. That was the second wrong thing. Zaire woke up on the first morning expecting locked doors, bars, someone standing outside with instructions about what he was and wasn't allowed to do. He had been in enough houses, enough systems, to know the architecture of captivity. It always announced itself. But when he turned the handle on the bedroom door, it opened. He stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then he stepped back inside and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about that for a long time. Breakfast appeared at a small table near the window. No one brought it in front of him. No performance of service. It was simply there, and it was exactly the kind of food Zaire would have chosen himself. Not the heavy, rich things that sat in the stomach like a warning. Something lighter, intentional, that bothered him more than a locked door would have. He ate slowly, watching the window. The estate grounds stretched wide and quiet below. Green, maintained. Guards moved in patterns at the perimeter, but none of them were stationed near the house itself. Not pointing inward. Pointing out. Zaire filed that away and said nothing. Kaler appeared mid-morning. He didn't knock. He walked in the way men like him always did, like space rearranged itself for them. But he stopped several feet away, leaned against the wall near the door with his arms at his sides. Not crossed, not aggressive, just present. You didn't eat everything, Kaler said. I ate enough. That's not the same thing. Zaire looked at him directly. No, it's not. Something shifted in Kaler's expression, barely visible, like a door opening 1 inch and then closing again. He watched Zaire the way a person watches a fire they've never seen behave this way before. Not with fear, with focus. He crossed the room, slowly, stopped 2 feet in front of Zaire and reached toward the table, toward the glass near Zaire's hand. Zaire did not move back. He held his ground, kept his breathing even, kept his eyes level. Kaler's hand paused mid-reach. He wasn't looking at the glass anymore. He was looking at Zaire. At the fact that Zaire had not flinched, had not stepped back, had not performed the automatic retreat that every Omega under pressure was expected to produce. "You were trained," Kaler said quietly. Not angry, not impressed, just certain, not raised. Zaire said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't cost him something. 3 days in, that was when it happened. Kaler had been circling. Not literally, but in the way predators circle when they're not sure what they're dealing with. Close proximity, testing reactions, watching what moved and what didn't. Zaire had held, every time, until the morning Kaler came in while Zaire was standing near the window reading something that had been left on the table. A newspaper, folded open to the business section, nothing significant, and he crossed the room without announcing himself. He reached past Zaire. For the newspaper. His arm moved into Zaire's peripheral vision, and Zaire flinched. Not far, not dramatic, just a sharp pull backward, shoulders drawing in, hands coming up slightly. A full-body recoil that lasted less than a second. Reflex, pure and unthinking. The newspaper stayed on the table. Kaler had gone completely still. His arm was still extended. He wasn't touching Zaire. He hadn't been trying to touch Zaire. But the flinch had already happened. It sat between them now like something spilled. Zaire straightened immediately, reset, face blank. But the damage was already done, not damage to him. The damage was to the story he had been telling with his stillness. The story that said, "Nothing gets to me. Nothing reaches me. I am fine." That story had just cracked open in front of a man who read people for sport. Kaler lowered his arm slowly. He didn't speak right away. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable. Worse than that, careful. Like he was choosing what came next with surgical precision. "You think I'm like them?" Not a question, not an accusation, just something he had arrived at. A conclusion he had walked to slowly and was now standing in front of. Zaire's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, because the silence was the answer, and they both knew it. Kaler stepped back. 1 step, 2, putting distance between them that Zaire had not asked for and somehow needed anyway. He looked at Zaire for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that Zaire couldn't name. Not pity, not hunger, something quieter than both. Then he walked out. No explanation, no instruction, just gone. And that night, Zaire noticed it when he checked the way he always checked. The security around the estate had doubled. Not around his room, around the perimeter. Not watching him, watching for something else. Routine settled in like weather. Not warm, not cold, just present. Every morning the food was there. Every afternoon Kaler appeared somewhere in the house. The study, the hall, the garden once, and said very little. Watched. Filed things away behind eyes that gave nothing back. Zaire adapted. That was what he did. What he had always done. He found the shape of a place and moved through it without breaking anything. He learned where the cameras were. There were 7 that he could see. He learned the guard schedules. He learned that the kitchen staff left by 6 and that one of the side doors took 12 seconds longer than it should because something was wrong with the hinge. He wasn't planning an escape. Not yet. He was just knowing. Knowing was the only thing that had ever kept him safe. On the 5th day, he went looking for something to read and ended up in a room that connected to the East Hall. A kind of secondary study, smaller than Kaler's main office. Bookshelves on 3 walls. A desk pushed against the window. He found the surveillance feeds by accident. A monitor, half covered by a jacket someone had left draped across the chair, was running a quiet loop of exterior shots. Perimeter, gate, driveway, one view of the rear garden. He stared at it. Not one shot of the interior. Not one camera inside the house itself. Which meant every camera Zaire had identified, every angle he had mapped and memorized over 5 days was pointed out. Not in. He stood in that room for a full minute processing what that meant. Kaler wasn't watching him. He was watching for threats trying to get in. Zaire turned to leave, and saw the desk. The papers on it were in a neat stack except for one file, slightly offset from the rest. Not quite closed. Like someone had been reading it and set it down in a hurry. He shouldn't have looked. He knew he shouldn't have looked. His name was on the tab. His own name. Printed on a file that was sitting in a room he wasn't supposed to be in. Zaire picked it up the way a person touches something hot. Fast, controlled, committed. He opened it. The first page was medical. Dates. Clinical language. Numbers that translated, if you knew what you were reading, into a very specific kind of history. Hormone levels. Suppression records. Behavioral assessments going back years. Farther back than Zaire had expected. Farther back than felt possible. He turned the page. Behavioral notes. Subject demonstrates atypical resistance to standard compliance protocols. He turned another page. Compliance conditioning modified track. Subject exhibits unnatural restraint response. Recommend continued monitoring. He stopped. Read that line again. Unnatural restraint response. He had read about himself in clinical terms before. Had heard himself described in the language of reports and assessments and quiet conversations held in rooms just out of earshot. But this was different. This was documented. Organized. This was someone taking notes on him the way a person takes notes on an experiment. Not a person. Property. His hands were steady. He was making sure of that. But somewhere under the steadiness, something was pulling loose from where it had been anchored. He turned one more page. The notes went back further. Much further. He had been monitored before the house he escaped. Before the transfer. Before what he thought was the beginning of the chain. The record started earlier than any of it, which meant someone had been watching him, documenting him, running assessments on him for longer than he had known he was being held at all. The paper in his hands blurred slightly. He blinked. Refocused. He pressed the blankness back over his face and locked it there, hard. He was not going to fall apart in a secondary study in Kaler Virex's estate while holding a file with his name on it. He was not. He was already setting the file back down, already straightening its edges, already composing himself back into the shape that had kept him alive. When footsteps stopped in the doorway, he didn't turn around. He already knew. You weren't supposed to find that yet. Kaler's voice. Even. Quiet. Not angry. Yet. That word was doing a lot of work. Zaire turned. Kaler was standing in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides. Watching Zaire the way he always watched. Like he was reading something only he could see. But his jaw was tight. His eyes had gone somewhere colder. Not cold like cruelty. Cold like something that was trying to hold itself together. The file sat between them on the desk. And Zaire said nothing. Because the question of how long Kaler had known, and why that file existed in his possession at all, was pressing against the back of Zaire's throat like something he couldn't afford to say out loud. Not yet. Not until he understood what it meant that Kaler had it. What do you think Kaler actually knows? And how long has he been watching Zaire before any of this started? Drop your theory in the comments. The answer coming in the next chapters will shock you. Do you even know what they did to you? The question landed like something thrown. Not shouted. Kaler never shouted. But his voice had changed. Stripped of the measured distance he always kept between himself and everything around him. What was left underneath was raw. Harder. Different. Zaire stood on the other side of the desk with the file between them and said nothing. His face was still. Hands at his sides. Breathing even. Every single thing about him was composed. And Kaler was watching that composure the way a person watches a wall they know is about to crack. You read it, Kaler said. Yes. All of it. Enough of it. Kaler moved. Not toward Zaire, away. He crossed to the window and stood there with his back turned. One hand pressed flat against the glass. Outside, the afternoon light was cutting long shadows across the garden. Clean, indifferent. His shoulders were tight. That was the thing that stopped Zaire cold. Because Kaler Virex did not carry tension in his body. In every interaction Zaire had observed over the last 5 days, the man moved like someone who had never been surprised by anything. Controlled, measured, contained. But right now his shoulders were tight. They modified your responses, Kaler said without turning around. Suppressed the natural development. Ran conditioning protocols over years, not months. Years. He paused. And documented every single session like it was research. Zaire's jaw pulled once. He reset it. I know I survived, he said. Kaler turned from the window. He looked at Zaire for a long moment. And whatever he was feeling moved through his face in a way he couldn't fully contain. Not anger. Not calculation. Something underneath both of those things that didn't have a clean name. That's not enough, Kaler said. It was enough for me. That's exactly what I'm talking about. His voice dropped. You learned to call survival enough because no one ever showed you it could be more than that. The room was very quiet. Zaire didn't answer. Not because he had nothing to say. Because the thing rising in his chest right now was not something he could afford to let out in this room, in front of this man, with the file still sitting open on the desk between them. He held it, pressed it back down. Kaler watched him do it, and that act of watching Zaire perform the very suppression the file documented, made something cross Kaler's face that looked almost like pain. I'm going to find out who did this, Kaler said. Quiet, absolute, not a promise made to Zaire. A decision already made for himself. And somehow that was worse, because Zaire had spent his entire life surrounded by men who made decisions about him. And this was the first time one of those decisions felt like it wasn't about ownership at all. He didn't know what to do with that. Speech balloon when someone fights for you before you even ask them to. Does that feel like safety, or does it feel like a different kind of trap? Tell me in the comments. The message came through at 2:47 in the morning. Zaire didn't know that at first. He was asleep, actually asleep, which was still a strange thing in this house. When the sound of fast footsteps in the hall outside pulled him up. Not running. Too controlled for running. But fast. Purposeful. He was out of bed before he was fully awake. He crossed to the door and opened it without making a sound. 2 guards moving toward the east stairwell. Radios out. Faces tight. One of them glanced at Zaire and kept moving. Didn't stop him, didn't tell him to go back inside. Just kept moving. That was the first indicator. The second was Kaler. He was already in the hall, and he had clearly not been asleep. Dressed. Alert. A phone pressed to his ear and something in his expression that Zaire had not seen before. Not the cold calculation of observation. Not the careful distance of a man choosing his words. This was operational. Focused in a way that had edges. He ended the call. Looked at Zaire standing in the doorway. Go back inside, he said. What happened? Not a question. A statement. Because Zaire was not going back inside. Kaler looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then he crossed the distance between them, lowered his voice and said, They sent a message. Your previous handlers. They want you returned. The word handlers sat in the air between them. Not people. Not a family. Not even a faction. Handlers. The message was specific, Kaler continued. They called you property. And they named a timeline. Zaire's chest locked down. His face did not move. How long? He said. 48 hours. Silence. 48 hours. Kaler watched him. Watched the way Zaire received information like a wall receiving rain. Nothing visible. Everything absorbed. And something moved in Kaler's eyes that looked a lot like anger. Not at Zaire. At the people who had built a person capable of absorbing a 48-hour countdown with no visible reaction. You're not going back, Kaler said. Flat. Final. You don't know what they're capable of, Zaire said. I know exactly what they're capable of. He paused. That's why you're not going back. He turned and gave a short, Direct instruction to the guard at the end of the hall, 3 sentences, low and even. The guard moved immediately. Another door opened somewhere below. Radios clicked on one after another in a quiet chain reaction spreading through the estate. Kaler turned back. No one takes what's under my protection. He said it like it was a law. Like he had already decided it was a law and the rest of the world simply had not caught up yet. And Zaire stood there in the hallway at 2:47 in the morning and felt something shift in the floor beneath him. Not physically, just the coordinates of everything. The doctor's name was Renata Osei. She arrived at the estate the following morning with a bag, a tablet, and the kind of expression that said she had seen things she was not going to describe in polite conversation. Kaler brought her in, introduced her to Zaire without asking permission, which Zaire noted, and then stepped back and stood against the wall while she worked. He didn't leave. Zaire didn't ask him to. The examination wasn't long. Renata was precise. She asked clean, direct questions and didn't editorialize when Zaire answered them in the same flat tone he used for everything. She looked at records on her tablet. Records that matched the file Zaire had read the day before, and her face stayed professional and controlled. But her hands paused twice. Just slightly. Just for a second. Both times, Zaire filed it away. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at Kaler with something in her expression that was not neutral. He looked back at her. They held a conversation in the space between them that didn't require words. Then Renata packed her bag and left the room. Kaler didn't move from the wall. The silence stretched for a while. Your hormone levels, he said finally. They've been suppressed. Consistently. For a long time. Zaire said nothing. The behavioral conditioning isn't just psychological. It's chemical. They were adjusting your body's chemistry alongside the behavioral work. He stopped. It wasn't protection. I know. Zaire. His voice shifted. You were preserved, not protected. There's a difference. That word. Preserved. It landed differently than Zaire expected. He had known the clinical reality for a long time. Had understood, in the abstract way a person understands something they can't fully afford to feel, what had been done to him. He had filed it under survival. Under things that didn't matter anymore because he was still here. But Kaler sang it out loud. Preserved. Like a specimen. Like something kept in a jar. The composure Zaire had been holding for 5 days, maybe longer, maybe for years, shifted. Not visibly. Not in any way a person watching him could name or point to. But something underneath moved. Like a structural thing. Like weight redistributing across a surface that had been holding too much for too long. He breathed. Once. What hurt most wasn't what they did, Kaler said quietly, almost to himself. It's that they decided you didn't deserve a choice. Zaire looked at him. They decided all of it, Kaler continued. What you felt. How you responded. What your body did. And they called it control. He paused. And you had to call it your life. Zaire's hands were still at his sides. He was still holding it together. But Kaler was watching him, and for the first time Zaire did not feel like something being studied. He felt like something being seen, which was somehow much harder to hold up under. Kaler took one step toward him, then stopped himself. He stood there, the distance between them small enough to feel and large enough to mean something, and did not close it. Has anyone ever told you the truth about yourself in a way that hurt more than any lie ever did? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If I let you go, Kaler said it standing near the window in the main study with the afternoon light flat and gray through the glass. The estate was locked down. Guards at every point. Renata's report sitting in a sealed envelope on the desk. They will find you. He said the second part without looking at Zaire. Zaire was sitting in the chair across from the desk. Not because anyone had told him to sit, but because his legs had carried him there and he had not argued with them. He looked at Kaler's profile against the window and waited. Kaler turned. And if I keep you? He stopped. The question sat in the room unfinished. What does that make me? Zaire said. Kaler looked at him directly. Yes. That was the thing about him that Zaire had not prepared for. Not the power. Not the reach. Every man in Kaler's world had power and reach. That was not remarkable. What was remarkable was that Kaler Virex, in this moment, with a 48-hour deadline running down and an enemy faction actively moving against him, was questioning himself. Out loud. In front of Zaire. The silence between them was long. Neither of them moved to fill it. Outside, somewhere on the east side of the estate, Zaire could hear the low activity of the security team doing what it was trained to do. Running quiet. Running thorough. I'm not asking you to trust me, Kaler said. I'm not asking for anything. Then what are you doing? I'm telling you what's true. He crossed the room. Stopped a few feet away. They are coming. That's true. You cannot go back there. That's also true. He paused. And I am not going to hold you here against your choice. That's the last truth. Zaire looked at him. For a long moment he just looked. At the man who had taken him from one controlled environment and had, somehow, made the space between the walls feel less like captivity and more like something Zaire didn't have a word for. Who had read a file about the worst thing that had ever been done to him and responded with something that looked nothing like hunger. You could have used this, Zaire said. Everything in that file. You could have used all of it. Yes. Why didn't you? Kaler held his gaze. Because you are not an asset, he said. You are a person. And someone should have said that to you a long time ago. The room went very quiet. Zaire's chest was doing something complicated. He didn't move, didn't speak right away, just sat with the weight of what had just been said to him. Said simply, without performance, without expectation of anything back. Then Kaler said, softer. You don't belong to anyone now. Zaire looked at him for a long time, and then why do I feel safer here? He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It just came out, and Kaler heard it, and the way his face changed. Not into something triumphant, not into something hungry, but into something almost relieved. Like a man who had been holding a very careful line for a very long time and had just been told he could breathe. That was the moment. Not a declaration. Not a claim. Just two people standing in the same room, both of them choosing to stay. The threat didn't disappear overnight. That mattered. This wasn't a clean ending. The faction that had sent the 48-hour message was still out there. Still moving, still calculating, still operating on the belief that Zaire was property to be recovered. Kaler's security team had intercepted 2 more communications by the following morning. Both of them cold. Both of them specific. This was not over. Zaire knew that. Kaler knew that. And yet, the morning after everything, after the confrontation, after Renata's visit, after the words in the study that neither of them had walked back, Zaire came downstairs and found Kaler in the kitchen. Not his staff. Him. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, reading something on his phone, still half-dressed. No suit. No controlled presentation. Just a man in the early morning light being exactly what he was. He looked up when Zaire walked in. Didn't say anything. Zaire crossed to the counter and poured coffee for himself and stood on the other side of the kitchen island, and they stayed like that for a while. Quiet. Not the silence of tension. Not the silence of 2 people avoiding something. The silence of 2 people who had already said the hard things. This was what came after. Late morning, Kaler was at his desk. Zaire walked through the main study. Not looking for anything specific, just moving through the house the way he had started to do, and Kaler's hand came up slightly as he passed. Not a grab. Not a reach. Just a small, open gesture. Almost involuntary. He caught himself. Pulled it back. Went back to the papers in front of him. Zaire stood there for a moment. Then he kept walking. But slower. That afternoon, they sat in the same room for the first time without any pretense of business. No file between them, no assessment running, no positioning of power. Kaler had a book. Zaire had found something to read from the shelf. The light through the west windows went long and golden and then slowly faded. No one came in. No one needed to. The external threat was still real. The file still existed. The faction's timeline was still counting down, and Kaler's people were working through the night to get ahead of it. There was nothing resolved about their situation. Nothing tied up. Nothing guaranteed. But Zaire sat in that room and did not calculate the exits. He just sat. And Kaler, across the room with the book in his hands, was not watching him. He was just present. That evening, when the light had gone completely and the estate had settled into its night routine, Kaler came to the doorway of the room Zaire was in and stood there for a moment. He was going to say something. Zaire could tell, the way a person who had learned to read people could always tell. But he didn't. He almost did. His hand came up slightly toward the doorframe, and then he just looked at Zaire for one long, quiet moment, and walked away. And Zaire sat in the chair in the dark room and felt something he had not felt in longer than he could accurately count. He felt like he was somewhere. Not trapped. Not placed. Not stored. Somewhere. He didn't cage me, the story goes. He didn't claim me. But for the first time, I wasn't trying to escape. Some bonds don't announce themselves. They don't come with chains or contracts or loud declarations. They come quietly. In the space between two people who have both survived things they shouldn't have had to, and chose, despite everything, to stay. Which moment in this story hit you the hardest? And why? Tell me in the comments. Your answer might say more about your own story than you realize. If this story moved you, if you found something in Zaire or Kaler that felt real, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is built to make you feel something, think something, and carry something with you. Share this one with someone who needs it today. The next story is coming, and it starts in a place no one expects.